Welcome to the world behind midnight, where the shadows between fact and fear grow thin. Tonight, we descend into Texas limestone, where something ancient still hunts. Stay close, the dark is watching. On March 19, 2019, a decorated Navy veteran made a phone call that should never have been recorded. His voice was steady when he said, "They're not animals. They think, they plan, and they're coming through my door." The line went silent at 3:47 a.m. What arrived at dawn found only blood and intelligence no beast should possess. The Llano uplift stretches across central Texas like the exposed bones of the earth itself. Ancient granite and Precambrian schist thrust upward through younger limestone, creating a landscape of hidden valleys, spring-fed rivers, and cave systems that have never seen sunlight. The Spanish called it La Frontera del Inferno, the frontier of hell. The Tonkawa people who lived there before Europeans arrived had a different name. They called it the hunting ground of the old ones, and they left offerings at certain cave mouths, deer hearts, and clay figures, tokens meant to appease something that dwelt below. Job Barnett was 68 years old when he called the Llano County Sheriff's Office at 11:34 p.m. on March 19, 2019. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a Marine Corps rifleman, earned a Bronze Star, and returned to Texas to build a cattle operation on 3,000 acres of hill country his grandfather had homesteaded in 1891. In 50 years of ranching, he had dealt with drought, disease, market crashes, and every predator native to Texas. He had never once asked for help from law enforcement. The 911 recording began with 7 seconds of breathing before Barnett spoke. His voice carried the flat affect of a man describing a tactical situation rather than a personal crisis. "I need to report a livestock attack. I've lost 9 head of cattle in the past 4 nights. The animals are being killed in a pattern, hamstrung first, then exsanguinated while still alive." The dispatcher asked standard questions about coyotes or feral dogs. Barnett's response was measured and precise. "Ma'am, I've been killing coyotes since before you were born. These aren't coyotes." There was a pause, during which the recording captured a sound in the background, something between a howl and a vocalization that seemed to carry syllables. The dispatcher asked Barnett to repeat his last statement. He didn't. Instead, he said, "I need you to understand something. I'm looking at them right now through my kitchen window. There are 11 of them in my yard. They're not scattered like normal canids. They're in formation, 3 flanking left, 3 right, 5 holding center. They're not opportunistic. They're tactical." The dispatcher began to respond, but Barnett continued speaking as if he hadn't heard her. "One of them just looked directly at me through the window. Eye contact, sustained eye contact. It's not running. It's not afraid. It's calculating. Animals don't calculate." The dispatcher urged him to stay inside and said deputies were en route with an estimated arrival time of 35 minutes. Barnett replied, "35 minutes is too long. They're testing the doors now. I can hear them at the back entrance." One just stood up on its hind legs to reach the handle. Full bipedal posture, like a man standing. Canids don't do that. They don't think that way. The recording captured the sound of wood splintering, then Barnett's voice, sharp and commanding. "They're coming in. I'm engaging." 2 gunshots, the heavy report of a large caliber rifle, then 3 more in rapid succession. Screaming, not human, but vocalized in a way that suggested more than animal pain. Then sounds the forensic audio technician who analyzed the recording later described as cooperative, feeding behavior by multiple large predators coordinating over a common food source. The 911 line remained open for 19 minutes. No one at the sheriff's office ever listened to the full recording more than once. Deputies arrived at the Barnett Ranch at 4:22 a.m. They found the back door torn from its hinges, the wood frame shattered inward with enough force to bend the steel deadbolt. They found Job Barnett's rifle on the kitchen floor, a Remington 700 in.3 U06 Springfield, 5 spent casings scattered across the tile. They found blood, far too much blood, smeared across the walls in patterns that suggested something had been dragged rather than chased. They found tracks in the blood, canine in basic structure, but wrong in proportion. Each paw print nearly 6 inches across, with claw marks that gouged the hardwood floors. Outside, the deputies found the cattle Barnett had mentioned. 9 Herefords dead in the south pasture, each killed in precisely the method he described. But they also found something else. In the soft earth, near the back door, they found tracks that showed stride lengths exceeding 5 feet, suggesting an animal moving at speeds that shouldn't have been possible for anything that size. They found tufts of fur caught on the barbed wire fence, coarse and dark, longer than coyote fur, but with a texture that didn't match any canine species native to Texas. They didn't find Job Barnett. They never found Job Barnett. The official report filed by Deputy William Reed listed the incident as a probable animal attack, with the victim missing and presumed deceased. Reed's notes included observations that didn't make it into the official narrative. Tracks suggest packed coordination far exceeding normal canine behavior. Attack pattern indicates planning rather than opportunistic predation. Victims' defensive wounds and spent ammunition suggest prolonged engagement with multiple large animals. Recommend immediate consultation with Texas Parks and Wildlife regarding unknown predator species. The recommendation was filed with the county and forwarded to state authorities. It never reached anyone official. Someone else had been monitoring incidents in the Llano Uplift for years. Someone who recognized the pattern and knew exactly what had killed Job Barnett. The Llano Uplift is one of the oldest exposed rock formations in North America. The granite at its core dates back over 1 billion years, pushed to the surface by tectonic forces that shaped the continent when life on Earth was still microscopic. Over time, younger limestone deposited by ancient seas covered the granite, creating a landscape of layered stone riddled with dissolution, caves, underground rivers, and caverns that extend for miles beneath the surface. The Texas Speleological Society has documented over 5,000 caves in the region. They estimate that number represents less than 20% of the total cave systems actually present. The Tonkawa people who inhabited the region before European contact understood that the caves were not empty. Their oral traditions, recorded by Spanish missionaries in the 1720s, spoke of the Nahani, the old ones who hunt below. According to Tonkawa cosmology, the Nahani were not spirits, but flesh and blood creatures that had lived in the caves since before humans walked the earth. They hunted at night, moving in packs with intelligence that rivaled human hunters. They could run faster than horses, track prey by scent across miles of terrain, and coordinate attacks with a sophistication that made them apex predators in a landscape filled with dangerous animals. The Tonkawa avoided certain valleys and certain cave entrances where the Nahani were known to den. They left offerings, not as worship, but as appeasement, a recognition that the creatures were owed respect for sharing the hunting grounds. The Spanish missionaries who arrived in the 1700s documented similar beliefs among the Lipan, Apache, and Comanche bands that moved through the region. Father Asahal Moreno, writing in 1738, described lobos grandes, great wolves of unusual size and cunning that hunt in silence and show no fear of fire or guns. He noted that native converts refused to travel certain trails after dark and would abandon campsites if they heard specific vocalizations coming from underground. The pattern continued after Anglo settlement. Between 1840 and 1910, the Llano Uplift recorded 473 disappearances that were never satisfactorily explained. Prospectors who went into the hills looking for gold and never returned. Homesteaders who settled near cave systems and were found dead within months, their cabins torn apart, their livestock slaughtered, their bodies partially consumed and arranged in ways that suggested deliberate display. Travelers who camped in the wrong valleys and simply vanished, leaving behind only tracks that led into the limestone crevices and never came out. The explanations varied by era. In the 1840s, the disappearances were blamed on Comanche raids, despite the fact that many victims were found in ways inconsistent with Comanche warfare. In the 1870s, the deaths were attributed to Mexican bandits, though no bandits were ever caught, and the kill patterns didn't match human predation. By the early 1900s, The official explanation had settled on mountain lions and feral hogs, an answer that satisfied authorities, if not the ranchers who actually lived in the region. The ranchers developed their own survival protocols. Don't camp within 200 yards of cave entrances. Don't travel alone after sunset. Don't ignore howling that seems to come from below ground rather than above it. And if you encounter canines that seem too large, too coordinated, too unafraid of human presence, don't try to chase them off. Run for the nearest structure with walls and a roof, lock every entrance, and pray they lose interest before dawn. The protocols worked well enough to maintain a fragile equilibrium. The creatures, whatever they were, seemed content to hunt the abundant wildlife that filled the hill country. White-tailed deer, javelinus, descended from Spanish livestock, wild turkeys, feral hogs that had multiplied into the millions. They took cattle and sheep occasionally, but rarely enough that ranchers considered it an acceptable cost of doing business in remote country. They took humans even more rarely, targeting the isolated, the foolish, the ones who violated the old protocols. For over a century, the balance held. Then Texas entered a drought cycle that would become the worst in recorded history. Between 2011 and 2018, the Llano Uplift received less than 60% of its normal rainfall. Rivers that had flowed continuously since the last ice age shrank to intermittent pools. Springs that had supported Tonkawa camps and Spanish missions went completely dry. The wildlife populations crashed. White-tailed deer herds declined by 40%. Javelina populations collapsed in some areas by as much as 70%. The wild hogs, more adaptable than most species, concentrated around the few remaining water sources, becoming more aggressive and dangerous in their desperation. The apex predators that depended on this prey base faced a choice. They could starve, waiting for the drought to break and the ecosystem to recover. They could migrate, abandoning territories their kind had held for millennia in search of better hunting grounds elsewhere. Or they could expand their definition of acceptable prey to include the one species that had water, food, and meat in abundance, even during the worst droughts. The creatures chose the third option. They began hunting humans in numbers that couldn't be ignored. The first indication that something had changed came in the form of livestock losses that exceeded normal predation patterns by orders of magnitude. In the winter of 2016, ranchers across 6 counties in the Llano Uplift reported cattle killed in numbers that made no ecological sense. A ranch near Fredericksburg lost 14 head in a single night. A sheep operation near Mason lost 32 animals over 3 nights. A goat ranch outside Llano lost 63 animals in a week, all killed in the same distinctive pattern. Hamstrung first, tendons severed with surgical precision, then exsanguinated, throats torn open, while the animals were still alive and bleeding out onto the ground. Finally consumed, the carcasses stripped with an efficiency that left only bones and hide. Texas Parks and Wildlife sent investigators. They attributed the losses to feral dog packs, a known problem in rural Texas, where abandoned pets formed into semi-wild groups that hunted livestock. The recommended solution was standard predator control: traps, poison bait stations, helicopter surveys to locate den sites, and permission for ranchers to shoot on sight any dogs found harassing livestock. The ranchers implemented every recommended measure. The livestock losses continued. The kills showed a level of coordination that feral dogs, even large packs, simply didn't possess. Witnesses reported seeing the animals move in formations that suggested military-style tactics, flanking maneuvers and diversionary attacks that separated herds and isolated individual targets. In April 2017, a wildlife camera placed by rancher Basil Jest near his water tank captured footage that he initially shared with Texas Parks and Wildlife, then with county law enforcement, and finally, when both agencies dismissed the video as inconclusive, uploaded to the internet. The footage showed a pack of canines moving through the frame in single file. They resembled coyotes in their basic morphology: pointed ears, bushy tails, elongated snouts, but the proportions were completely wrong. They were enormous, each animal easily twice the size of the largest coyote ever documented in Texas. Their legs were disproportionately long, giving them a gait that seemed almost mechanical in its efficiency. Their shoulders showed muscle development that suggested power far beyond what their frames should support. Most disturbing was their behavior. The pack moved in complete silence. No vocalizations, no jostling for position. Perfect coordination that suggested either extensive training or an intelligence that allowed them to coordinate without sound. As they passed the camera, the lead animal stopped, turned its head, and looked directly into the lens. The footage showed its eyes, reflective in the camera's infrared illumination, glowing not with the typical green of tapetum lucidum, but with an amber gold color that seemed wrong, almost aware. The animal held the camera's gaze for 3 seconds, then continued moving. The video was viewed over 4 million times before it was removed from multiple platforms for unspecified violations of community guidelines. Basil just received visitors 2 days after the video went viral. 2 men in civilian clothes driving an unmarked vehicle with government plates. They identified themselves as wildlife management contractors and advised Jess that his footage had been misidentified as depicting an unknown species, when in fact it showed large coyote-dog hybrids, a known phenomenon in areas where coyotes and feral dogs interbred. They strongly suggested that Jess remove the video from all platforms and refrain from discussing it publicly. When Jess asked why the government was interested in what he considered a local wildlife issue, the older of the 2 men smiled without warmth and said, "Because sometimes local issues have implications beyond what civilians understand. We're asking politely now. Don't make us ask impolitely." Basil Jess took his family and moved to Oklahoma 3 weeks later. He never spoke publicly about the footage again. But the sightings continued, and they were no longer confined to livestock predation. Hunters reported being followed through the brush by animals that matched their pace exactly, staying just beyond rifle range, watching with those wrong-colored eyes that seemed to track not just movement, but intention. Ranchers found their guard dogs dead, not killed in fights that would show defensive wounds and scattered fur, but killed with single crushing bites to the skull that shattered bone and killed instantly. The message was clear: stay out of our territory, or what happened to your dogs will happen to you. People began disappearing. Not in numbers that would trigger federal attention or media coverage, but enough that local law enforcement noticed a pattern. A surveyor working alone near Enchanted Rock in November 2017 radioed his office that he was hearing vocalizations that didn't match any animal he recognized. He never radioed again. Search teams found his equipment 3 days later, his GPS unit still recording his last position, but no sign of the man himself. A family camping in the Pedernales Falls area in January 2018 failed to check out of their campsite. Rangers found the tent intact, food still in the cooler, all personal belongings present. The family was gone. The only tracks leading away from the campsite were large canine, heading directly toward a cave entrance 200 yards to the north. By March 2019, when Job Barnett became the 9th confirmed disappearance in 3 years, someone in a position of authority decided the situation had escalated beyond containment. The creatures weren't content to share the hill country anymore. They were reclaiming it, systematically eliminating the human presence that had encroached on their territory over the past century and a half. Something had to be done, and it had to be done by people who understood that conventional wildlife management had failed completely. The creatures were too smart, too fast, too coordinated to be handled by park rangers and county sheriffs. They required operators trained to hunt the most dangerous prey on Earth, human or otherwise. The first indication that something had changed came in the form of livestock losses that exceeded normal predation patterns by orders of magnitude. In the winter of 2016, ranchers across 6 counties in the Llano Uplift reported cattle killed in numbers that made no ecological sense. A ranch near Fredericksburg lost 14 head in a single night. A sheep operation near Mason lost 32 animals over 3 nights. A goat ranch outside Llano lost 63 animals in a week. all killed in the same distinctive pattern. Hamstrung first, tendons severed with surgical precision, then exsanguinated, throats torn open, while the animals were still alive and bleeding out onto the ground. Finally consumed, the carcasses stripped with an efficiency that left only bones and hide. Texas Parks and Wildlife sent investigators. They attributed the losses to feral dog packs, a known problem in rural Texas, where abandoned pets formed into semi-wild groups that hunted livestock. The recommended solution was standard predator control: traps, poison bait stations, helicopter surveys to locate den sites, and permission for ranchers to shoot on sight any dogs found harassing livestock. The ranchers implemented every recommended measure. The livestock losses continued. The kills showed a level of coordination that feral dogs, even large packs, simply didn't possess. Witnesses reported seeing the animals move in formations that suggested military-style tactics, flanking maneuvers and diversionary attacks that separated herds and isolated individual targets. In April 2017, a wildlife camera placed by rancher Basil Jest near his water tank captured footage that he initially shared with Texas Parks and Wildlife, then with county law enforcement, and finally, when both agencies dismissed the video as inconclusive, uploaded to the internet. The footage showed a pack of canines moving through the frame in single file. They resembled coyotes in their basic morphology: pointed ears, bushy tails, elongated snouts, but the proportions were completely wrong. They were enormous, each animal easily twice the size of the largest coyote ever documented in Texas. Their legs were disproportionately long, giving them a gait that seemed almost mechanical in its efficiency. Their shoulders showed muscle development that suggested power far beyond what their frames should support. Most disturbing was their behavior. The pack moved in complete silence, no vocalizations, no jostling for position. Perfect coordination that suggested either extensive training or an intelligence that allowed them to coordinate without sound. As they passed the camera, the lead animal stopped, turned its head, and looked directly into the lens. The footage showed its eyes, reflective in the camera's infrared illumination, glowing not with the typical green of tapetum lucidum, but with an amber gold color that seemed wrong, almost aware. The animal held the camera's gaze for 3 seconds, then continued moving. The video was viewed over 4 million times before it was removed from multiple platforms for unspecified violations of community guidelines. Basil Jest received visitors 2 days after the video went viral. 2 men in civilian clothes driving an unmarked vehicle with government plates. They identified themselves as wildlife management contractors and advised Jest that his footage had been misidentified as depicting an unknown species, when in fact it showed large coyote-dog hybrids, a known phenomenon in areas where coyotes and feral dogs interbred. They strongly suggested that Jest remove the video from all platforms and refrain from discussing it publicly. When Jest asked why the government was interested in what he considered a local wildlife issue, the older of the 2 men smiled without warmth and said, "Because sometimes local issues have implications beyond what civilians understand. We're asking politely now. Don't make us ask impolitely." Basil Jest took his family and moved to Oklahoma 3 weeks later. He never spoke publicly about the footage again. But the sightings continued, and they were no longer confined to livestock predation. Hunters reported being followed through the brush by animals that matched their pace exactly, staying just beyond rifle range, watching with those wrong-colored eyes that seemed to track not just movement, but intention. Ranchers found their guard dogs dead, not killed in fights that would show defensive wounds and scattered fur, but killed with single crushing bites to the skull that shattered bone and killed instantly. The message was clear: stay out of our territory, or what happened to your dogs will happen to you. People began disappearing. Not in numbers that would trigger federal attention or media coverage, but enough that local law enforcement noticed the pattern. A surveyor working alone near Enchanted Rock in November 2017 radioed his office that he was hearing vocalizations that didn't match any animal he recognized. He never radioed again. Search teams found his equipment 3 days later, his GPS unit still recording his last position, but no sign of the man himself. A family camping in the Pedernales Falls area in January 2018 failed to check out of their campsite. Rangers found the tent intact, food still in the cooler, all personal belongings present. The family was gone. The only tracks leading away from the campsite were canine, large canine, heading directly toward a cave entrance 200 yards to the north. By March 2019, when Job Barnett became the 9th confirmed disappearance in 3 years, someone in a position of authority decided the situation had escalated beyond containment. The creatures weren't content to share the hill country anymore. They were reclaiming it, systematically eliminating the human presence that had encroached on their territory over the past century and a half. Something had to be done, and it had to be done by people who understood that conventional wildlife management had failed completely. The creatures were too smart, too fast, too coordinated to be handled by park rangers and county sheriffs. They required operators trained to hunt the most dangerous prey on Earth, human or otherwise. The United States government has been aware of anomalous predator populations in remote regions since at least 1897, when the Texas Rangers filed reports of wolf attacks in the Llano Uplift that killed settlers in patterns inconsistent with normal wolf behavior. Those early reports were dismissed as frontier exaggeration, tall tales told by people who saw bears in every shadow and Indians behind every tree. The dismissals stopped in 1936 when a military convoy traveling between Fort Hood and Fort Sam Houston lost 4 soldiers to what the official report called attack by unidentified large canines of unusual size and aggression. The soldiers had stopped to repair a vehicle on a remote stretch of road that cut through the heart of the Llano Uplift. According to the 2 survivors, the attack came at dusk from multiple directions simultaneously. The creatures moved faster than anything the soldiers had ever seen, covering open ground in bounds that seemed impossible for animals that size. They worked together with a coordination that reminded the survivors of infantry tactics, flanking maneuvers, and concentrated assault on the weakest points of the defensive perimeter. 2 soldiers were killed immediately. The other 2 were dragged into the brush before the survivors could mount an effective defense. Search parties found one body 2 days later, partially consumed and cached under limestone slabs in a manner that suggested the creatures had been storing food. The incident was investigated by Army intelligence, classified at a level that would remain sealed for decades, and added to a file that had been slowly accumulating since the Texas Rangers' first reports. The file grew steadily over the years. In 1954, a zoologist named Dr. Temperance Harlow, working under contract with agencies that didn't officially exist, conducted a 20-month field study in the Llano Uplift. She interviewed ranchers, examined kill sites, collected tissue samples from partially consumed livestock, and deployed camera traps in areas where the creatures were known to hunt. She managed to capture 4 photographs before her equipment was systematically destroyed by something that left claw marks gouged into reinforced steel housing. The photographs showed an animal that Dr. Harrow classified as Canis dirus texensis, the Texas dire canid. It was related to the modern coyote in the same way that the extinct dire wolf was related to contemporary gray wolves. Larger, heavier, more robustly built, with skeletal adaptations that suggested a predatory lifestyle fundamentally different from its smaller cousins. The specimens photographed by Dr. Harrow measured between 40 and 50 inches at the shoulder, roughly twice the size of the largest coyotes ever documented. Their leg bones showed proportions adapted for sustained pursuit over rough terrain, rather than the short burst sprinting typical of modern canids. Their jaws exhibited muscle attachment points that suggested bite forces exceeding those of modern wolves by significant margins. But the feature that most concerned Dr. Harrow was the cranial capacity. Analysis of the photographs, combined with plaster casts she made of tracks and one partial skull recovered from a collapsed cave entrance, suggested that these animals had brain case volumes 35 to 40% larger than standard coyotes, room for neural tissue that might support cognitive capabilities far beyond normal canine intelligence. Her report concluded with a recommendation that was unusual for a scientific document. Immediate population control measures including lethal elimination of breeding adults before territorial expansion places these animals in direct competition with human settlements. Consider complete eradication if population proves resistant to conventional control. The recommendation was noted by officials who had the authority to authorize such actions. It was not implemented. The creatures were confined to remote hill country, where human population density was low, and the occasional livestock kill, or even rarer human disappearance, could be explained through conventional predation. The cost of a full elimination operation, the personnel required, the risk that such an operation would draw public attention to a problem the government preferred to keep quiet. All of these factors outweighed the perceived threat. The file was maintained, the population was monitored through periodic field studies and reports from local law enforcement, and the killings continued at a rate that could be statistically categorized as acceptable losses. This passive monitoring approach worked for 6 decades. Then the drought changed everything. The Joint Task Force, responsible for tracking anomalous wildlife populations in the continental United States, detected the territorial expansion in 2015. The dire canids were moving beyond their historical range, establishing hunting grounds in areas where they hadn't been documented in living memory. By 2017, the population had spread across 8 counties, more than double their previous territory. The pack structures were changing too. Instead of family groups containing 4 to 6 individuals, the dire canids were forming super packs of 15 to 25 animals, cooperative hunting groups that could bring down prey far larger than any individual could manage alone. And they were becoming more aggressive toward humans. The 2018 attacks marked a clear threshold. 5 people killed or disappeared under circumstances that could not be attributed to conventional predators. 2 ranch hands found dead in their bunkhouse with the door torn inward and their bodies partially consumed. 3 hikers who set up camp in a valley known locally as Dead Man's Hollow and were never seen again, despite extensive search operations that covered every square mile of terrain within a 10-mile radius. The monitoring program was upgraded to active interdiction. Federal agents working through Texas Parks and Wildlife launched what they publicly called a feral dog control initiative, but was actually a targeted elimination campaign against the dire canid population. Professional hunters were deployed, men with military backgrounds who understood that they were hunting something far more dangerous than feral dogs. Poison bait stations were established at known travel corridors. Helicopter surveys searched for den sites, using thermal imaging that could detect concentrations of body heat underground. Over an 18-month period, the operation killed exactly 7 dire canids, 7 animals out of an estimated population that had grown to somewhere between 200 and 300 individuals. The creatures learned faster than the hunters could adapt. They learned to avoid the bait stations. They learned to recognize the sound of helicopters and disappear into caves before the aircraft could pinpoint their location. They learned which humans were threats and which were prey, and they adjusted their behavior accordingly. After Ja Barnett's death in March 2019, officials reviewing the accumulated file reached a unanimous conclusion. The dire canid population had grown beyond the point where passive containment was viable. Active interdiction had failed to meaningfully reduce their numbers. The creatures were now actively hunting humans in their own homes, showing a level of boldness that suggested they no longer saw people as threats to be avoided, but rather as prey to be taken whenever opportunity presented itself. Something had to be done, and it had to be done by operators who understood that they were hunting not animals but intelligent adversaries who would learn, adapt, and fight back with everything they had. The request moved through channels that existed only in classified communication systems. It reached a commander who had overseen operations against human adversaries in environments ranging from Afghan mountains to Iraqi cities. He understood immediately that conventional wildlife management techniques were inadequate for this situation. What was needed was a team that combined the tracking skills of hunters with the tactical capability of special operations forces. He knew exactly where to find such people. The mission was designated Operation Limestone Hunter. The objective was straightforward in concept, if extraordinarily difficult in execution. Locate the primary superpack, eliminate breeding adults to prevent population replacement, and destroy den sites to deny the creatures their primary refuge. reduce the population to a level where they would retreat into the deepest caves and resume their historical pattern of avoiding human contact. The team was assembled from personnel with specific skill sets. They needed experience in tracking and hunting dangerous game. They needed combat experience in environments where the enemy was intelligent, adaptive, and motivated to kill. They needed to be comfortable operating in remote areas with limited support and no possibility of extraction if things went wrong. Most importantly, they needed to be people who could accept that what they were hunting was real, that it didn't fit into conventional categories, and that keeping that reality classified was as important as the elimination mission itself. 6 operators met those criteria and accepted the assignment. They deployed to Texas in late April 2019 with equipment that didn't appear on any official manifest and authority to engage targets that didn't officially exist. Sheriff Desire Gorley of Llano County had been in law enforcement for 18 years. She had worked everything from drug interdiction to human trafficking cases. She had dealt with cartel enforcers and domestic terrorists and sovereign citizens who thought the law didn't apply to them. She had never dealt with anything like the animal attacks that had been plaguing her jurisdiction for the past 3 years. Her case files on the incidents filled an entire filing cabinet by the spring of 2019. She had photographs of kill sites that showed a level of precision that shouldn't be possible for animals operating on instinct. She had plaster casts of tracks that didn't match any species in any wildlife identification guide. She had audio recordings captured by ranchers' security systems, vocalizations that analysis suggested came from animals with vocal structures significantly different from any known canid. She also had political pressure from every direction. County commissioners wanted the problem solved, but didn't want to spend money on specialized wildlife control. State agencies wanted local law enforcement to handle it, but wouldn't provide the resources necessary for an effective response. Federal authorities kept showing up to confiscate evidence and tell her to focus on public safety while leaving the investigation to people with proper jurisdiction, which apparently meant everyone except the sheriff actually responsible for protecting her constituents. Gorley didn't respond well to being pushed aside. She made copies of everything before turning over evidence. She kept her own files, her own notes, her own theory about what was really happening in the Llano Uplift. When 2 men in civilian clothes showed up at her office on April 28, 2019, asking to review everything she had on the animal incidents, Gorley knew immediately they weren't from any conventional agency. They carried themselves like military, that particular combination of physical confidence and situational awareness that came from operating in places where mistakes got you killed. They showed identification that listed them as contractors for the Department of Agriculture, which Gorley knew was cover for something else entirely. She looked at the older of the 2 men, late 40s with scars on his hands that suggested close-quarters combat, and said flatly, "Who do you really work for, and what are you really doing here?" The man smiled without any warmth, reaching his eyes. "We work for people who handle problems that local authorities can't handle, Sheriff. Problems that don't fit into normal categories and require specialized solutions. The things that have been killing people in your county, what would you say they are if you didn't have to write an official report?" Gorley considered the question. She could give the official answer: feral dog hybrids, large coyotes, conventional predators. Or she could tell the truth to people who might actually be prepared to do something about it. "They're not animals," she said. "Not in the way we use that word. They think, they plan. They communicate in ways that suggest intelligence far beyond what dogs or coyotes should have. And they're killing people because they want this territory back. They're not just hungry, they're territorial, and they've decided we're the invasive species." The man nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he already knew. "We're here to reduce the population to a level where that territorial aggression stops. We have a team deploying in the next 72 hours. They'll need detailed information about terrain, water sources, locations of recent attacks, and anything else you have that might help them understand how these things move and where they den." He placed a folder on her desk. It was thicker than any case file Gorley had ever seen. "This is everything we know about what you're dealing with. It goes back further than you might think. Much further. Gorley opened the folder and found herself looking at reports that dated back to the 1890s. Photographs from the 1950s showing animals that shouldn't exist. Analysis documents that used terms like relic population and Pleistocene survivor and cognitive capacity equivalent to large primates. She read for 10 minutes in silence while the two men waited. When she finally looked up, she asked the only question that mattered. Can you kill them? The man's smile was grim. We can reduce their numbers enough that they'll go back underground and stay there. Whether we can kill them all, whether anyone could kill them all, that's a different question. These things have survived for 10,000 years. They're good at surviving, but we can hurt them badly enough that they'll remember to fear humans again. That's the goal. The team established their base at the old Whitlock property, an abandoned ranch 15 miles northeast of Llano, on land that backed against the Colorado River's limestone bluffs. The ranch house had been built in 1898 and abandoned in 1994 after the family that owned it experienced what surviving relatives described only as trouble with the local wildlife that made the property unlivable. The house still stood, weathered but structurally sound, isolated enough that the team could operate without civilian observation. The 6 operators who gathered there on May 1, 2019, represented some of the most experienced hunters and combat veterans in the United States Special Operations community. The team leader was Senior Chief Enos Hall, 43, a career Navy SEAL with 25 years of service. Hall had grown up in the Texas Hill Country, born and raised on a ranch outside Junction, where he'd learned to hunt before he learned to drive. He knew this landscape intimately, every canyon and creek bed, every cave entrance and game trail. His teammates called him Flint because of his ability to start fires in any condition and his reputation for being hard and sharp-edged when the situation required it. He was the team's navigator and tactical planner, the one who would coordinate their movements through terrain where GPS was unreliable and conventional maps missed the underground complexity that defined the Llano uplift. His second-in-command was Chief Sarah McGee, 39, from the swamp country of southeast Georgia. McGee had learned to track in environments where visibility was measured in feet and survival depended on reading signs that most people couldn't see. She was the team's primary tracker, trained in techniques that combined modern technology with traditional skills passed down through generations of hunters. Her specialty was understanding how prey animals moved through their environment, where they denned, where they hunted, where they felt safe. That understanding would be critical when hunting creatures that had survived in this landscape for 10 millennia. The heavy weapons specialist was Senior Chief Jane Lineborough, 37, from the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Lineborough had grown up hunting deer and black bear in terrain that taught you to shoot straight because you rarely got a second chance. She carried a custom-built rifle in 338 Lapua Maginum, a round designed for extreme long-range precision that could punch through body armor at 1,000 yards. If the dire canids were as heavily built as the reports suggested, standard hunting calibers might not provide adequate stopping power. Lineborough's rifle would drop anything in North America with a single well-placed shot. The team's designated marksman was Chief Constance Milligan, 35, from the high plains of Wyoming. Milligan had eyes that could detect movement at distances that required optics for most people. She carried a rifle in .300 Winchester Magnum, a proven long-range caliber that combined accuracy with terminal performance. Her job was to provide overwatch during operations, positioned on high ground where she could see the entire area of operations and engage targets before they got close enough to threaten the rest of the team. In an environment where the enemy was fast, intelligent, and potentially capable of ambush tactics, having someone watching from above might mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Technical operations and communications were handled by Chief Asahel Gordon, 32, from Northern California, with a background in wildlife biology before joining the military. Gordon understood predator behavior in ways the other operators didn't. He knew how pack animals coordinated, how they communicated, how they established territories and defended them. He brought equipment that could track the dire canids through multiple sensor types: motion detection, thermal imaging, acoustic monitoring that could analyze vocalizations and potentially predict where the creatures were moving. In a hunt where the prey was as intelligent as the hunters, technology would provide an edge that might determine the outcome. The youngest member was Chief William Reed, 29, from rural Tennessee. Reed was the team's point man, fast, aggressive, with reflexes honed by years of close-quarters combat in urban environments. He had the kind of situational awareness that kept people alive in places where threats could emerge from any direction at any moment. He was also the team's skeptic. He'd seen a lot of strange things during his military career, but prehistoric coyotes that thought like people pushed the boundaries of what he was willing to accept without direct evidence. That skepticism would serve the team well. Overconfidence got people killed. Healthy skepticism kept people alert. The briefing was conducted by the gray-haired contractor who'd met with Sheriff Gorley, a man who identified himself only as Sutton. He set up a projector and began with a photograph that was grainy and black and white, but clear enough to show an animal that looked like a coyote in the same way a tiger looks like a house cat. "What you're hunting has been called many things over the years," Sutton began. "Ghost dogs by the Tonkawa, devil wolves by the Spanish, dire canids by the few scientists who have studied them. The classification that stuck is Canis dirus texensis. They're a surviving population of Pleistocene megafauna that adapted to cave environments when their surface habitat disappeared at the end of the last ice age, approximately 11,000 years ago. They've been living under the Llano uplift ever since." He clicked to the next slide, showing a map of the region with red markers indicating attack sites and blue circles marking suspected den locations. Current population estimate is between 200 and 250 individuals organized into super packs of 15 to 30 animals. The primary pack, the one responsible for the majority of recent human predation, appears to contain approximately 22 adults based on track analysis and vocalization counts. Their territory centers on a cave complex in the Colorado River watershed about 9 miles from this location. "That's your primary target." Hall leaned forward. "What makes them different from standard coyotes besides size?" Sutton didn't hesitate. "Intelligence. Their cranial capacity is 35 to 40% larger than a standard coyote's. They demonstrate problem-solving abilities, coordinated hunting strategies that rival wolf packs, and what appears to be a complex communication system. They learn from experience. They remember threats. They adapt their behavior to counter those threats faster than any conventional predator we've studied." Job Barnett fought them for nearly 20 minutes, based on audio analysis of his 911 call. They didn't just overwhelm him with numbers. They tested his defenses, identified weak points, and coordinated an entry strategy that bypassed his strongest defensive position. McGee spoke up. "How do we kill them?" Sutton clicked to a slide, showing anatomical diagrams. "Headshots are most effective. Their skulls are reinforced, denser bone structure than modern canids, but a high-velocity round will penetrate. Center mass shots will stop them if you hit the heart or lungs, but they have pain tolerance that exceeds anything you've encountered. We have documented cases of these animals continuing to fight with injuries that would incapacitate a wolf or dog. Severed limbs, massive blood loss. They keep coming until catastrophic trauma shuts down the brain or heart. Fireworks. They avoid it instinctively, probably an evolutionary adaptation from living in caves, where fire means toxic smoke in enclosed spaces." Gordon raised his hand. "What about their senses? If they're cave adapted, are they sensitive to light or sound in ways we can exploit?" Sutton nodded. "Good question. They have exceptional low-light vision, better than wolves, but they're not exclusively nocturnal. They hunt whenever opportunity presents itself. Their hearing is acute across a broader frequency range than domestic dogs, which means they'll detect you before you detect them, unless you're using sound suppression. Their sense of smell is their primary hunting tool. They can track prey by scent across miles of terrain and distinguish between individual humans based on scent alone. That last part is important. They know who's been in their territory. They remember." He clicked to a final slide, a thermal image showing a pack of heat signatures moving through brush in a formation that looked unnervingly tactical. Your mission is population reduction with emphasis on eliminating breeding adults. Find the primary pack, destroy their den site, if possible, reduce their numbers to the point where they'll retreat to the deepest caves and resume their historical pattern of avoiding human contact. If you can eliminate the entire pack, that's ideal, but don't assume it'll be easy. These creatures avoided extinction for 11,000 years by being smarter and tougher than everything that tried to kill them. Respect that. Plan accordingly. And remember that if things go wrong, there's no extraction coming. You're on your own out there. Hall stood on the porch of the Whitlock house as the last light faded from the western sky. The limestone bluffs stretched before him, gray and orange in the twilight, riddled with shadow-dark cave entrances that could hide anything. He'd hunted this country since childhood. He knew its beauty and its danger, the way a sudden rainstorm could turn dry creek beds into raging torrents, the way rattlesnakes hid in the cool shade under limestone slabs, the way heat exhaustion could kill you in summer if you didn't respect the sun. But he'd never hunted anything like what waited out there in the gathering darkness. Somewhere in those caves, the dire canids were waking. They were stretching muscles that had evolved over millennia to make them perfect predators. They were testing the air with noses that could detect a human from miles away. They were communicating with vocalizations that carried information about prey location, threat assessment, pack coordination. They had ruled this landscape since before humans built cities or planted crops. Tonight, 6 operators with rifles and technology were coming to challenge that rule. Hall checked his rifle one last time and stepped off the porch into the dark. The hunt had begun, and there was no turning back. The Llano uplift at night was a world transformed. What looked like ordinary hills and valleys in daylight became a maze of shadows and ambiguous shapes that could hide movement until it was too late to react. The team moved out at 2,130 hours in 2 vehicles, modified UTVs, with sound-dampened engines and infrared lighting invisible to the naked eye. Hall led the first vehicle with McGee and Lineborough. Reed commanded the second, with Gordon and Milligan. They maintained 100-meter separation, close enough for mutual support, far enough that a single ambush couldn't take out the entire team. The route followed game trails and dry creek beds, avoiding ranch roads where their movement would be predictable and exposed. Hall navigated from memory, recognizing landmarks he'd known since boyhood: the twin oaks on the ridgeline, the limestone formation shaped like a breaking wave, the draw where his father had taught him to field dress his first deer. Tonight he was tracking something far more dangerous than deer, something that might be tracking him in return. McGee was first to spot sign. "Scat," she said quietly, pointing to a pile beside the trail. She knelt to examine it with a red-filtered flashlight that wouldn't ruin their night vision. Fresh, within the past 6 hours. Composition shows deer hair, bone fragments, probably from a mature doe, based on the hair length. These things are eating full-grown deer, not just the fawns and weak ones. That's apex predator behavior. They continued deeper into the backcountry. At 2,245 hours, Gordon's sensors registered the first contact. Audio signature, approximately 300 meters northwest. Vocalization pattern doesn't match standard coyote calls. It's more complex, longer duration, with frequency modulation that suggests information content beyond simple territory marking. Hall raised his fist, halting both vehicles. In the sudden silence, he could hear it. A howl that rose from the darkness ahead, wavering and sustained, unlike any coyote or wolf he'd ever heard. It seemed to carry meaning, to communicate something specific to listeners who understood the language. Then another howl answered from the east. Then a third from the south. They were being triangulated, surrounded by vocalizations that marked their position with disturbing precision. "They know we're here," Reed said, his voice tight with tension he was trying to suppress. Hall nodded. "They knew before we left the ranch. These things have been monitoring us since we arrived. They know we're not ranchers or hikers. They know we're something different, something that might be a threat." Milligan scanned the darkness through her night vision scope. "So what do we do?" Hall made his decision. "We stop acting like prey, and start acting like predators. Dismount. We go in on foot, where we can use terrain to our advantage. The vehicles make us visible and predictable. On foot, in the dark, we're ghosts. They spread into tactical formation, moving uphill toward a limestone ridge that would give them overwatch of the surrounding terrain. The howling continued, 3 distinct voices maintaining their positions, tracking the team's movement with a patience that suggested they weren't planning an immediate attack. They were gathering information, assessing the threat, communicating with the rest of the pack. Hall reached the ridge first and went prone at the crest, scanning the valley below through his night vision optic. The world became shades of green and gray, every detail sharp in the enhanced light. For 30 seconds he saw nothing but cedar and limestone and the slow movement of wind through brush. Then movement. A shape emerged from the shadows at the base of the ridge, moving low to the ground, with a fluid grace that looked wrong for something that size. It was easily as large as a full-grown German shepherd, but leaner, with legs that seemed disproportionately long and a head that was subtly wrong in its shape. Dire canid. Another appeared behind it, then 2 more, then 4 more emerging from different points around the valley, converging on the base of the ridge with coordinated precision that made Hall's skin crawl. 8 of them visible, probably more hidden in the brush, moving into position with the discipline of a trained military unit. "I have eyes on," Hall whispered into his comm. 8 contacts confirmed, possibly more. "They're massing at the base of our position, establishing a perimeter," McGee observed from her position, 20 meters to Hall's left. "They're not attacking, they're setting up. This is reconnaissance, not assault." She was right. The creatures weren't charging uphill into the team's overlapping fields of fire. They were positioning themselves, covering potential escape routes, establishing control over the terrain. This was predator behavior elevated to a level that shouldn't be possible for animals operating on instinct alone. They were planning, evaluating, preparing for whatever came next. Linebro settled into her firing position, adjusting her scope. "Whenever you're ready, Chief. I can drop the big one on the left. That's probably the pack leader based on positioning." Hall considered the tactical situation. They could engage now, try to kill as many as possible before the pack scattered. But that would give away their capabilities, show the creatures what they were up against, and potentially allow the survivors to adapt their tactics. Or they could observe, gather intelligence, learn how these things moved, and communicated before committing to direct action. The decision was made for him when one of the dire canids raised its head and looked directly at his position. The creature's eyes caught the ambient light, reflecting amber gold in a way that seemed almost luminous. It held Hall's gaze for 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. Then it vocalized, a sound that started low and rose in pitch and complexity, clearly directed at the other animals. Every dire canid in the valley turned and looked directly at the ridge, at the exact position where the team was concealed. "They made us," Reed hissed. "How the hell did they make us?" Gordon's voice came through the comm, tight with realization. "Infrared. They can see infrared. The optics we're using emit a signature we can't see, but they can. We're lit up like Christmas trees to anything that can detect near-infrared wavelengths." The dire canids began moving, not away but toward the ridge, spreading into an assault formation that would hit the team from multiple angles simultaneously. Hall made the call. "Engage. Weapons free. Drop as many as possible before they close." Lineborough fired first. The .338 Lapua Magnum round crossed the 300 meters between her position and the lead dire canid in a fraction of a second. The creature moved at the exact instant she pulled the trigger. A lateral shift that turned a killing headshot into a shoulder wound that spun the animal sideways and sent it tumbling. It screamed, a sound that was neither howl nor bark but something disturbingly close to human agony. The valley erupted. The dire canids charged, covering ground in bounds that ate up distance with terrifying speed. Hall fired, his rifle barking in controlled pairs. One creature went down with a headshot that sent it skidding across the limestone. McGee dropped another with a shot that caught it mid-lep, but the others were adapting, using the terrain, staying in the shadows, approaching from angles where the team's concentrated fire couldn't reach them. "Contact right," Milligan shouted. A dire canid burst from the cedar, not 15 feet from her position, too close for her long rifle. She transitioned to her sidearm, a .45 caliber pistol, loaded with hollow points designed for maximum tissue damage. She got 3 rounds into the creature's chest before it hit her, jaws snapping for her throat. She got her forearm up, and the teeth closed on reinforced Kevlar instead of flesh. The creature's weight drove her backward, its amber eyes burning into hers with an intelligence that was impossible and undeniable. Reed shot it through the skull at contact distance. The dire canid collapsed on top of Milligan, its body twitching, its jaws still locked on her arm even in death. Gordon's voice cut through the chaos. I count at least 15 more, converging on our position. They're calling reinforcements. The whole pack is mobilizing. He was right. The howling had intensified. Not just the 3 original voices, but dozens rising from the hills all around them, answering the distress call of the wounded and the dead. The team hadn't been hunting the dire canids. The dire canids had been hunting them, using the initial contact to assess their capabilities and draw them into terrain where numbers and coordination would overcome superior firepower. Hall made the only decision that kept them alive. Fall back to the vehicles. We're not dying on this ridge tonight. They retreated down the opposite slope, moving in leapfrog fashion, with half the team providing cover, while the other half displaced. Hall counted 6 confirmed kills before they reached the UTVs, more than anyone had managed in years of trying. But the pack wasn't broken, wasn't even significantly reduced. They had been tested, and they had learned. The team mounted their vehicles and accelerated into the darkness with the sound of howling rising behind them like a chorus of condemnation. The dire canids had survived the encounter, so had the team. Both sides now understood what they were facing, and both sides knew the real battle was yet to come. They found the primary den 3 days later, but those 3 days were not spent resting. The initial contact had taught the team a brutal lesson. The dire canids were faster, smarter, and better coordinated than any briefing had prepared them for. Standard hunting tactics wouldn't work against prey that could think tactically, that could learn from a single engagement and adjust their behavior accordingly. The team adapted their approach, moving only during daylight hours, when the creatures were least active, using drones to scout ahead before committing to any movement, avoiding predictable routes that could be anticipated and ambushed. Gordon's analysis of the vocalizations provided the breakthrough. He spent 2 days reviewing audio recordings captured during the initial contact and from sensors he'd deployed across the region. They're using directional calls, he explained, displaying spectrograms on his laptop. Different frequency patterns correlate with different information content. Location markers, threat assessments, coordination signals for pack movement, but there's a pattern underlying all of it. The calls orient toward a specific geographic point, like they're checking in with a central location or reporting back to a command structure. Pack animals don't usually have that level of centralized coordination, but these things aren't usual pack animals. The point Gordon identified was a limestone escarpment in the Colorado River watershed, approximately 9 miles from the Whitlock Ranch. Satellite imagery showed a network of cave openings scattered across a rock face that rose 200 feet above the surrounding terrain. Geological surveys indicated the caves were part of a larger subterranean complex that might extend for miles beneath the surface. A labyrinth of passages and chambers carved out by water over millions of years. This was the den, the heart of the dire canid territory, the place where they bred and raised young and retreated when threatened. If the team could destroy this location, they could break the pack's cohesion and force the survivors to scatter. They approached at dawn on the 4th day, when the morning sun was just cresting the eastern hills and the creatures would be underground, sleeping after a night of hunting. The escarpment rose before them like a fortress wall, stratified limestone in shades of gray and rust, pocked with openings that ranged from narrow cracks barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through 2 gaping mouths 20 feet across. The air flowing from the caves was cool and damp, carrying a scent that Hall recognized from the kill sites they'd investigated. Musk and blood, and something organic that suggested concentrated animal presence, the accumulated smell of creatures that had denned here for generations. McGee identified the main entrance, a cave mouth approximately 30 feet wide and 12 feet high that descended into darkness at a gradual angle. But there'll be multiple exits, she said, pointing to smaller openings scattered across the rock face. These things didn't survive 11,000 years by letting themselves get trapped. They'll have escape routes, probably dozens of them leading to different parts of the cave system. Lineborough and Milligan split off too. Plant demolition charges at the secondary entrances, small explosive packages that would collapse the tunnels when detonated, sealing off escape routes and trapping whatever was inside. Hall, McGee, Gordon, and Reed would enter through the main opening and push the creatures toward the kill zone. The plan was simple. Simple didn't mean it would work. The cave mouth descended into absolute darkness that their tactical lights could only barely penetrate. Hall led the way, his rifle ready, his senses straining against the unnatural silence. The floor was covered in debris, bones and dried vegetation, and the scattered remains of countless kills brought back to this place over years or decades. The walls were marked with claw marks, deep gouges in the limestone that showed where generations of dire canids had passed through this tunnel. Some of the marks were old, weathered by time until they were barely visible. Others were fresh, sharp-edged, made within the past few days by animals that were probably still alive somewhere in the darkness ahead. At 50 meters, the passage branched. Left led downward into colder air and deeper darkness, where Gordon's thermal sensors detected no heat signatures. Right led upward toward what appeared to be a larger chamber where thermal imaging showed multiple concentrated heat sources clustered together. Right, Hall decided. That's where they'll be, sleeping in groups for warmth and security. The chamber they entered was enormous. Their lights revealed a space approximately 100 feet across, with a domed ceiling 60 feet high, a natural cathedral carved by water and time. The floor was covered with bedding material, dried grass and leaves, and shed fur arranged in clusters that marked individual sleeping areas. And in those clusters, curled together in groups of 3 and 4, the dire canids slept. Hall counted quickly, his heart sinking as the numbers climbed. 28 adults visible from his position, plus smaller forms that were probably juveniles too young to hunt. This wasn't just the primary pack. This was a breeding colony, multiple generations living together in the protected darkness of the cave system. The team was surrounded by more dire canids than anyone had seen in one place, possibly more than anyone had known existed. They were standing in the heart of a population that had survived since the Pleistocene, and they were about to try to destroy it. Set charges, Hall whispered. Timed detonation. We're bringing this entire section down. They moved in silence, placing explosive packages at structural points around the chamber. Natural columns that supported the ceiling, walls that showed stress fractures, choke points where collapse would cascade into adjoining passages. The creatures slept on, unaware that death was being arranged around them with military precision. Gordon was planting the final charge when his boot dislodged a stone. The sound was small, just a quiet clatter of rock on rock, but in the absolute silence of the cave, it was deafening. One of the dire canids raised its head. Its eyes opened, amber gold, in the beam of Hall's light, fixing on the intruders with instant awareness. The creature didn't bark or howl, it simply stared, processing what it was seeing with an intelligence that was visible in those eyes. Human intelligence looking out from a decidedly non-human face. Then it moved. The dire canid was on its feet in a single fluid motion, launching itself toward Gordon with acceleration that shouldn't have been possible from a stationary start. Gordon got his rifle up but not fast enough. The creature was on him, jaws snapping, claws raking across his tactical vest with enough force to tear through reinforced fabric. Hall shot it through the spine. The creature collapsed, twitching, and Gordon scrambled free. But the damage was done. The chamber erupted with movement. 27 dire canids came awake simultaneously, rising from their bedding with the coordinated precision of soldiers responding to an alarm. They didn't scatter in panic. They formed up, oriented on the threat, and prepared to defend their den with everything they had. Blow the charges, Hall screamed into his cum. Lineborough's voice came back immediately. Not yet. We're still at the secondary exits. Give us 90 seconds. They didn't have 90 seconds. The dire canids attacked from 3 directions at once, moving with a coordination that spoke of intelligence and planning even in the chaos of the moment. Hall dropped 2 with headshots before a third hit him from the side, driving him into the cave wall hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. His rifle went flying into the darkness. Teeth closed on his shoulder, punching through his tactical vest like it was paper, finding flesh and muscle and grinding down with crushing force. He drew his sidearm and emptied the magazine into the creature's skull at contact distance. The dire canid went limp and collapsed on top of him, its weight pinning him to the ground. McGee was fighting hand-to-hand with a dire canid that had knocked her weapon away. She had her combat knife out, stabbing repeatedly into the animal's neck and chest, while it thrashed and snapped, trying to get its jaws around her throat. Blood, hers, and the creature's, sprayed across the cave floor in the beam of her dropped flashlight. Reed shot the creature through the head, then shot another that was circling toward McGee's blind side. Then shot a third that emerged from a side passage they hadn't known existed. His magazine ran dry. He transitioned to his sidearm and kept firing. Gordon was down. A dire canid stood over him, its jaws locked around his thigh, shaking him like a dog shakes a toy. His screams echoed through the chamber, high-pitched and agonized. McGee shot the creature, then shot another that was moving toward Gordon's position, then shot a third that lunged at her from the darkness. Her rifle clicked empty. She dropped it and drew her pistol, continuing to fire with mechanical precision, even as dire canids closed in from every direction. They were going to die here in the dark, overwhelmed by creatures that had defended this den for thousands of years and weren't about to surrender it now. Lineborough Hall roared into his cum. Blow it now. We're not clear, but blow it anyway, or we're all dead. A pause that lasted an eternity, then Lineborough's voice, quiet and resigned. Fire in the hole. God forgive us. The secondary exits collapsed first with a rolling thunder that shook the entire cave system and sent dust cascading from the ceiling. Then, the primary charges detonated, and the world became chaos. The chamber's ceiling cracked. Massive slabs of limestone broke free and fell, crushing dire canids beneath tons of stone. The survivors fled toward the cave entrance, abandoning their tactical coordination in the face of total structural collapse. They ran directly into the kill zone that Milligan had established at the entrance. Milligan was waiting with her rifle, positioned on high ground with clear lines of sight to the cave mouth. The dire canids emerged in a panicked stream, running for their lives as the cave collapsed behind them. She fired methodically, dropping one after another as they appeared. Lineborough joined her, her rifle roaring, rounds finding targets with mechanical precision. The dire canids kept coming, kept dying, kept trying to escape the death trap their den had become. Inside the cave, Hall grabbed Gordon and dragged him toward the entrance. McGee had read, both of them bleeding but moving. The ceiling was coming down around them, dust and debris and massive chunks of limestone that crashed to the floor and explosions of shattered rock. They burst into daylight as the main chamber collapsed behind them. The rumbling continued for nearly 2 minutes, the earth itself groaning as thousands of tons of limestone settled into the void where the den had been. When it finally stopped, the cave entrance had disappeared, replaced by a wall of rubble that would take years to excavate if anyone even tried. Hall collapsed against a boulder, his shoulder bleeding badly where the dire canid's teeth had found flesh. Gordon was unconscious, his leg torn up but the bleeding controlled by a tourniquet McGee had applied. Reed had lost part of his left ear to claws that had come within inches of opening his skull. McGee had knife wounds across both arms that would require surgery to repair properly. They had survived, but barely. Around them, scattered across the hillside, lay the bodies of dire canids. Milligan counted while Lineborough provided security, scanning the surrounding terrain for any survivors that might be regrouping. 23 kills outside the cave, Milligan reported, plus whatever's buried under that. Hall looked at the collapsed entrance. 28 adults and an unknown number of juveniles had been in that chamber when the charges went off. If even half of them had been caught in the collapse, The team had just eliminated the largest concentration of dire canids anyone had ever encountered. "We got most of them," he said, his voice thick with pain and exhaustion. "Maybe all of them. Maybe." But that word would haunt Hall for the rest of his life. The extraction was brutal, as all extractions from firefights are. A helicopter arrived within 90 minutes of Hall's emergency beacon activation, landing in a clearing half a mile from the collapsed cave. Military medics stabilized Gordon, whose leg wound had barely missed the femoral artery and would require multiple surgeries to save the limb. Reed's ear was cleaned and bandaged, the missing tissue beyond reconstruction. Hall's shoulder was irrigated and packed, the medic noting that the bite showed signs of bacterial contamination that would require aggressive antibiotic treatment. McGay refused medical attention until she'd finished documenting the kill site with her camera, photographing every dire canid carcass, every track, every piece of evidence that might never be available for study again. "This is unprecedented," she said, her voice tight with emotion that might have been awe, or horror, or both. "No one's ever seen this many together. The scientific value of what we just destroyed is incalculable. These animals survived the Pleistocene extinction. They're a window into a world that disappeared 11,000 years ago, and we just buried it under tons of rock." Sutton, the gray-haired contractor who'd briefed them days earlier, stepped off the helicopter and surveyed the scene with cold professional assessment. "The scientific value isn't our concern," he said flatly. "Ensuring that none of this reaches the public is what matters now. These things are dead. They stay dead. They stay secret." The cleanup was absolute and thorough. The dire canid carcasses were sealed in specialized containers and airlifted to a facility in New Mexico that didn't appear on any official maps or budget documents. Tissue samples were taken, dental impressions made. Everything that could be studied was removed from the scene. Geological teams moved in to assess the collapsed cave, using ground-penetrating radar to confirm the den was fully sealed. Whatever remained inside would stay buried, entombed in limestone until erosion or geological processes reopened the chambers in some distant future when perhaps humans would no longer be around to find them. The cover story was deployed within 72 hours. The attacks across the Llano uplift were officially attributed to feral hybrid dogs, the result of an illegal breeding operation that had released aggressive animals into the wild. Ranchers were compensated for their losses through agricultural disaster relief programs. Families of the victims received settlements accompanied by non-disclosure agreements that carried both substantial financial incentives and vague legal threats about the consequences of violating those agreements. Joe Barnett's death became a feral dog attack, tragic but explainable. His daughter sold the ranch and moved to New Mexico, never speaking publicly about what had happened to her father. Sheriff Gorley received a visit from Sutton 3 weeks after the operation concluded. He brought her an updated file, classified documents that officially acknowledged what she'd known all along. The animals weren't feral dogs. They were relict predators, survivors from an age when mammals grew large and fierce and ruled a world humans hadn't yet inherited. "You were right," Sutton told her. "They were thinking, they were planning. They were everything you said they were, and now they're gone, or reduced to the point where they'll never threaten human settlements again." Gorley looked at the collapsed cave, visible in the surveillance photos Sutton had brought. "Are they gone?" she asked. "Or just reduced?" Sutton's smile was grim. "That's above my pay grade, Sheriff. I just eliminate threats. Whether the threat is truly eliminated, or just pushed back into the dark where it belongs, that's a question for people who think longer term than I do." The team was debriefed for 3 weeks in a secure facility that felt more like a prison than a medical center. Audio and video feeds from their helmet cameras were analyzed by specialists who focused on pack coordination, tactical awareness, and problem-solving behavior. "They're smarter than wolves," one analyst said, his voice carrying a mixture of scientific fascination and existential dread. "Possibly smarter than chimpanzees in terms of spatial reasoning and tactical planning. If they'd had another 1,000 years to evolve without human interference, they might have developed tool use. That's how close we came to sharing this continent with a rival apex predator that could think." Gordon lost his leg below the knee. Infection set in, despite aggressive antibiotic treatment. Necrosis spreading through tissue that the dire canid saliva had contaminated with bacteria that modern medicine struggled to identify. He was medically retired with full benefits, and a medal he would never be able to wear or explain. Reed returned to active duty, but requested transfer to units that operated in urban environments where the threats were human and therefore comprehensible. McGee went back to her team, but found herself requesting assignments that involved anything except hunting missions. She'd killed enough. She'd seen enough. She was done. Hall tried to return to normal operations. He failed completely. The sound of coyotes howling at night made him reach for weapons that weren't there. Darkness triggered anxiety responses that he couldn't control, even when he knew intellectually that he was safe. Enclosed spaces made his hands shake and his breathing accelerate. He'd killed something ancient, something that had survived everything nature threw at it for 11,000 years. The victory felt hollow, incomplete, temporary. He retired from the Navy in 2020 and returned to Texas, settling in the hill country he'd grown up in, where he could watch the limestone bluffs at sunset and wonder what still moved in the darkness beneath them, because the operation had been labeled a success, but Hall knew better. Success implied finality, implied that the threat had been eliminated. What they'd accomplished was reduction, temporary suppression of a population that had proven itself capable of surviving ice ages and droughts and everything else the planet had thrown at it for millennia. The primary den was destroyed. 23 adults were confirmed killed outside the cave. Probably another 20 to 30 were buried under the collapsed ceiling. That was significant, maybe even devastating to the local population. But eliminated? Extinct? Hall didn't believe it for a second, and neither did anyone else who'd actually fought the creatures in the dark. Hall tracked the unofficial reports with obsessive attention. A rancher in Mason County lost 12 goats in one night in late 2020, all killed with the distinctive hamstring pattern that marked dire canid predation. A hiker vanished on the Balanced Rock Trail in 2021, disappearing between 2 points on a well-traveled path with no evidence except tracks that park rangers photographed and then were told to delete. In 2022, a trail camera at Inks Lake captured footage that was confiscated within 24 hours, but not before the rancher who owned the camera described it to his neighbors. Something coyote-shaped but far too large, staring directly into the lens with embered gold eyes that seemed to glow with their own light. The dire canids had not been exterminated. They'd been hurt, badly hurt, their primary den destroyed, and their population reduced by perhaps half. But they were still out there, still breeding, still expanding their territory with the patient inevitability of a species that thought in terms of generations rather than years. The cave system beneath the Llano Uplift extended for hundreds of miles. The team had destroyed one den. There were others, had to be others, refuges where survivors could retreat and rebuild their population away from human interference. Hall knew it, with the certainty of someone who'd looked into those amber eyes and seen intelligence looking back. In spring 2023, a journalist named Rebecca Sutherland arrived at Hall's ranch. She said Sheriff Gorley had kept copies of everything, all the files that were supposed to have been destroyed or classified beyond reach. She said she was writing an investigation into the animal attacks that had plagued the Llano Uplift for years. Attacks that official sources attributed to feral dogs despite evidence that suggested something far stranger. Hall warned her that she wouldn't be believed, that the government would deny everything, that speaking to her would bring attention he didn't want. She said she already had enough evidence to publish with or without his cooperation. She just wanted the truth from someone who'd actually been there. Hall told her everything. The operation, the creatures, the intelligence that shouldn't exist in an animal that looked like a coyote, the cover-up that had buried the truth under layers of classification and misinformation, the certainty that despite everything the team had done, the dire canids were still out there, still hunting, still remembering what humans had done to them. "Why are you telling me this now?" Rebecca asked. "Because the problem isn't over," Hall said. "We bought time, maybe a generation, maybe less. But these things have survived for 11,000 years. They're not going away because we killed 50 or 60 of them. They're going to recover. They're going to expand. And eventually there'll be another drought or another environmental change that pushes them into conflict with humans again. When that happens, people need to know what they're facing. Rebecca Sutherland published her investigation in September 2023. It went viral before anyone could bury it, spreading across social media and alternative news sites faster than official denials could suppress it. The government response was predictable: complete denial, dismissal of all evidence as misidentified animals or fabricated footage, statements from wildlife officials assuring the public that no unknown predator species existed in Texas. Sutton, the contractor who'd briefed and debriefed the team, vanished from public record as if he'd never existed. But the story was out, and it couldn't be completely contained. Hunters across the Llano Uplift began carrying heavier caliber rifles. Ranchers reinforced their structures and installed security systems with thermal imaging. Tourists started asking questions about the animals that might be living in the caves. Questions that park rangers answered with official denials and unofficial warnings. Don't camp near cave entrances. Don't travel alone after dark. Don't ignore howling, that sounds wrong. The old protocols were being remembered, being passed down again to a new generation that needed to learn them. Hall called it the beginning, not the end. The dire canids had been pushed back, but they hadn't been defeated. They never would be. Autumn in the Llano Uplift remained beautiful, stunning vistas of limestone and oak, and rivers that still flowed despite years of drought. But beneath the beauty, beneath the tourist-friendly surface, the old rules reasserted themselves. Don't camp too close to darkness. Don't assume you're alone in the wilderness. Don't forget that humans are new to this landscape, and that other predators have older claims to this territory. In the limestone caves that honeycomb the region's foundations, survivors bred. Numbers grew slowly, carefully, with the patient inevitability of a species that understood survival on geological timescales. They remembered the humans who'd come into their den with fire and thunder. They remembered the ones who hadn't come back out. They hunted in remote valleys where people rarely traveled. They watched from ridgelines at sunset, testing boundaries, learning where humans went and where they didn't, where the new safe zones were and where opportunities might present themselves. Another drought would come eventually. Climate patterns suggested the region was entering a long-term cycle of increased aridity. When that drought arrived, when the prey animals declined again and the easy food sources disappeared, the dire canids would remember that humans were prey too. Soft, slow, abundant prey that could be taken if you were smart enough and patient enough and willing to wait for the right moment. Hall sat on his porch at sunset with a rifle beside him and every light burning against the gathering dark. Sometimes he heard them, never close enough to be immediate threats, but always there in the background, howling in the distance like echoes of a world that existed before humans and might exist after them. He'd killed 37 dire canids in 2019, more than anyone had managed in decades of trying. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. These creatures belonged to the Llano Uplift in a way humans never would. They'd survived ice ages and droughts and extinction events. They'd survived humans so far. They would continue surviving, adapting, remembering. On a ranch outside Llano, a family finished dinner and prepared for bed. Their dog refused to go outside, whining at the back door, but refusing to cross the threshold even when called. The father checked the locks on every door and window, an action that had become routine since the stories started spreading. Beyond the reach of the porch light, beyond the comfortable circle of illumination that marked the boundary of human safety, something watched with amber gold eyes, patient, hungry, remembering what were a few more years, what was a single generation. The dire canids had outlasted the mammoths and the saber-toothed cats. They would outlast the humans too. It was only a matter of time. If you still hear the howling after this, if you feel watched when you're alone in wild places, subscribe to The World Behind Midnight. Keep the lights burning. Another story waits in the dark. And remember, not all extinctions are permanent. Some things just learn to hide better.